biggest changes do you think leaders can and should make to make strategy, if you like, more successful, whether that's in the mindset, the model, or any other aspect? But what are the things that you think that they should be on the top of their agenda?
Well, the first thing is that they are incapable of creating strategy, and they have to admit it. That there's no small group of leaders at the top of any organization today who has the bandwidth, the imagination, and the foresight to develop a point of view about where the organization should go next. So the first step is to overcome the conceit that strategy is primarily the work of the CEO or the executive committee or those at the top of the pyramid. What we've seen again and again is that companies have missed the future, not because the future was unknowable, but because it was unpalatable. And particularly so to those that had spent a lifetime building the old model and had a lot of their emotional equity invested in the legacy strategy. So that, I think, is the first thing. I think the second thing is they have to recognize that the most important thing, let me back up. The second thing is they have to more clearly differentiate the work of what I might call strategizing and the work of planning. Yeah. Those two activities are often conflated, at least conceptually, when we talk about, inverted commas, strategic planning. But the reality is that planning and strategizing are entirely separate and distinct activities. And when that fact isn't recognized, what tends to happen is that the strategy making gets dramatically shortchanged, and much of the activities that go under the banner of strategic planning end up being focused almost entirely on relatively near-term execution. Yeah. So we have to start to see the work of creating strategy as something very distinct from the work of formulating action plans and programming activities. That would be my second thing. I think the third thing is to recognize that the most important thing about any strategy is how it's different from every other strategy. That was the premise of my article many, many years ago in Harvard Business Review titled "Strategy is Revolution." And I think I cannot claim to be the first, but I was certainly among the first who argued that creating strategy is essentially an innovative process. Yes. And that good strategies were ones that tended to challenge industry orthodoxies and be highly differentiated from other strategies. And later that became called disruptive innovation. But the argument that I made all those years ago was that only a strategy that is unconventional has any chance of producing unconventional returns. So I think that would be kind of my second point, or my third point rather. My fourth point would be that today, because of the level of volatility in the world, strategy has to be necessarily broad. That over specific strategies are likely to be rendered irrelevant by events. And so a strategy has to be broad enough to be useful in making choices, but not so narrow that it locks you into one path towards the future.
Absolutely.
So I think I think that's a good place to start, and we could go a little bit deeper in any one of those. Just one bit of context. When I first started teaching strategy, I was not trained as a strategist. I was trained, my PhD is in international business. And when I arrived at the London Business School, in 1983, they asked me to teach the core strategy course in the MBA program. Right. So I had to get a very quick orientation to strategy. Obviously, it wasn't entirely unfamiliar, having had an MBA and a PhD, but it was still a new field. Luckily, Michael Porter had written a very good book called Competitive Strategy, and it also produced a volume of case studies that went with that. So, relying on that plus a lot of other material, I was able to somehow deliver this course. But what struck me very early on as I thought about the problem of strategy, it struck me there were three fundamental problems, and Michael Porter did a brilliant job of addressing one of them, but hadn't looked at the other two, which you could hardly expect him to do. You can't do everything. So it's in no way a criticism of his work. It's just, there was a lot to cover there. So there are three important things to think about when it came to strategy. One is, why are some strategies more profitable than others? And what Michael Porter did essentially was to reverse engineer antitrust theory. So of course the concern of antitrust regulators is how do you avoid or how do you prevent companies from building monopoly advantages? The goal of strategy, of course, is to build those advantages.
Yes.
That's I think it was as Jack Welch once said, I want an unfair advantage. So Michael Porter very cleverly kind of reversed engineered antitrust policy and said, let's try to understand what things end up giving companies an extraordinarily strong, perhaps unassailable position with their customers and vis-a-vis their competitors. And so that yielded the famous 5 forces, which is an extraordinarily useful diagnostic tool and also is very useful in developing strategy, because you can start to ask, do we have a strategy that's likely to be, robust against new entrants and against alternatives and so on. But what hadn't been addressed really was, well, where do profitable strategies come from? It's one thing to look at an industry as Michael Porter did and say, let me understand why Coca-Cola makes more money than many of its rivals. But that doesn't tell me how Coca-Cola ended up in that position. And it gives me no direction if I'm starting with a relatively clean sheet of paper, or even if I'm working in a large incumbent organization. It gives me almost no direction on how I unearth a game-changing strategy with the power to produce above-average returns. So the problem of strategy creation really was not very much addressed in Michael Porter's work. And more generally, at the time, strategy was largely seen as a positioning exercise within existing competitive space or existing market space. Yeah, so do I want to be at the high end or the low end? Do I want to serve industrial customers or end customers? Do I want to compete on the basis of highly differentiated products or low-cost operations? So to a large extent, the competitive landscape was taken as more or less fixed. And that seemed to me to be a mistake, because what I could see even, back in the early 1980s was a variety of new companies, like at the time it was companies like Dell and, the early years of Apple and others who were coming along and changing the rules of the game. So for me, that was one of the most, the first question is, well, how do you know if it's a good strategy or not? Well, you can look at extant strategies and try to explain almost post hoc why some are more effective. And then you can reason from that broadly the sorts of strategies that are going to be more effective. But that doesn't tell you much about how to create them. That only gives you the filter for evaluating. Yeah. And so that led into my article, Strategy Revolution, and then it led more generally into years and years of working with organizations around the world on the problem of creating game-changing strategies. And that work, and I'll talk you through a bit of it only because I think it's very relevant to your starting problem. That work created billions of dollars of market value for a large number of organizations around the world where we work. So the other interesting question, and this is just kind of framing about what is strategy anyway. The other very interesting question to me that occurred about the same time was, right, well, we need to know how you find a new game-changing strategy. How do you get lightning to strike, as it were? But we also need to understand how do you uninstall a mature strategy that's lost its earning power, that's past its sell-by date. And again, there seemed to have been very little written about that. And yet, being in Michigan at that time and watching America's consumer electronic industry and auto industry get pummeled by new and unexpected Japanese competitors, it was clear that, strategy was not only a matter of instantiated plans, instantiated in capital and in processes and facilities, but strategy is very much also a matter of mental constructs that senior executives had a particular way of looking at the world, a particular way of defining the marketplace, who the customer was, and how you competed. That was the mental representation of a strategy, and that those mental representations, you might call them mental models, seemed very resistant to change.
Yes.
And in addition, you had all of the practical elements of retooling all of the operating system and so on to support a new strategy. So for most of my career, anyway, those have been the two questions I've been intrigued by. How do you create new game-changing strategies from the ground up, even inside legacy or incumbent organizations? And how do you change highly successful strategies when they are losing their economic power?
Yeah, brilliant. Wow, that's a tour de force. There's a lot to go on there. Before I perhaps come back to a number of the points and delve deeper, Gary, I wondered if I could just sort of keep going on the theme of, if you like, imagine yourself now, if you like, starting afresh. Well, I guess you could always be starting afresh every day, depending on how you approach life. But just imagine yourself starting afresh, and you've been, speaking with companies, consulting with companies, researching, etc., etc. What are the areas looking forward that you think have, if you like, the most promise to address some of the challenges you sort of articulated? The areas where you think, I think some more effort could focus on that, or actually that's a promising scene.
Well, let me go back to two of the most critical points I started with, and then we can talk about practically what you do. So I made two initial arguments, perhaps not in this order, but I argued that given the complexity in our world and the speed at which things are changing, no small group of senior executives has the bandwidth and the imagination to craft a robust, future-oriented strategy. My second point was that strategy, an effective strategy, is one that is highly differentiated. And that, by definition, I would argue, means it has to be built on insights that are not shared or obvious to many of your rivals. And so if you work this logic back, if to produce exceptional earnings, or let me say it this way, to produce exceptional earnings, you need an exceptional strategy. And to get an exceptional strategy, you need exceptional insights. I.e. insights that you are likely to get from consultants who've spent the last 10 years consulting with other companies in your industry. Yeah. But I think one of the worst possible developments for at least strategy making was when consulting companies started to verticalize by industry.
Completely. Oh gosh, this is a man I've worked with. I've
been saying this for 20 years. The chance. What I say inside companies is, if you're a bank, there's literally almost nothing useful you can use from another bank. from another bank. Learn from another bank. And particularly ones that look mostly like you. So take those two insights that the world is too complex for any small group of executives at the top to craft a groundbreaking future-focused strategy. And number two, whatever strategy you do create better be differentiated. Well, where that obviously leads me is to the fact that you need a strategy process that involves a lot of new voices. And in particular, I think that in strategy making, you need to give a disproportionate share of voice to three constituencies, maybe four. You need to give a disproportionate share of voice to young people because they're just living closer to the future. It is more real to them. You need to give a disproportionate share of voice to people at the geographic fringes of the organization who are not so are likely not to be so constrained by industry orthodoxy as those at the center. You need to give a disproportionate share of voice to people who've joined the company from other industries because they may have other ways of thinking about how you compete. And finally, you need to give a very large share of voice to customers and business partners outside your firm or outside the firm. So if I'm right on that, if I'm right that the only way, if I'm right that often there's a very shallow gene pool at the top of many large companies, and that you have to, if you want to get new insights, you have to involve new voices. Well, then those are the sorts of voices I would want to engage in the process.
Yes.
The question then becomes, how do you make strategy making a truly open process? And there are undoubtedly many ways to do that, but what I can tell you is how we do that and how I've done that for a long time. And I could take some recent experiences. Let me take one of my original experiences because those are the ones that tend to be formative. I was asked in the early 1990s, and without going back, I cannot tell you when, but let me say I was asked around 1992 or 1993 to help a small Finnish company called Nokia build its first real strategy in wireless communications. And the company had been in that business for a while as a result of a contract they had won originally with the Finnish military to provide them with mobile telephony. But being an ambitious group of young people at Nokia at the time, they wanted to make a mark in the world. And I remember a call, I won't remember who it was, but somebody called me. I'm guessing it was Pekka Ala-Pietela, who was the head of that business at the time. And he said, Gary, we want to beat Motorola. And Motorola, and I think they had read my article, Strategies of Revolution. And Motorola at that time was the number one wireless company in the world. It had basically invented the business and was also regarded as one of the best managed companies in the world. So I went up to Finland and to Espoo and their headquarters. And the first thing I said to them was, well, if you want to beat Motorola, you need a strategy that's nothing like Motorola's. And everybody else at the time, Siemens and Philips and Sony and Ericsson, whoever was in that business, they're pretty much all looking at it the same way. So what we did at Nokia, which we would repeat many times over the next several decades, was we took dozens of people. I won't remember how many, but it was, I'm sure it was dozens. And we organized them into teams. One set of teams was charged with really understanding the unarticulated needs of customers. What have customers not asked us for yet because they can't imagine the future either? What customers do we not even serve? What customers are not part of our market? So that group was charged with going out through observation, through what might now be called design thinking, but to go out through observation and try to understand what were the latent unmet needs that this new technology might allow us to address on behalf of customers. A second team was charged with looking at environmental shifts and trends or discontinuities in technology, in lifestyle, in business. But the goal, the question they were asked is, what are the emerging or nascent trends that our competitors are not yet paying attention to and that we might be able to profitably leverage? The third group was asked to think about what are the industry dogmas that we could challenge. So when we look at the major players at the time, where had their strategies all converged? And which of those beliefs or points of convergence were based not on immutable laws of physics, but just on a shared way of thinking. And then the fourth group was asked to look at the competencies and capabilities and assets of Nokia, and to ask, how do we leverage those in new ways to create new growth opportunities, and what additional competencies may we need to build or acquire? So over a period of several weeks, several months, each of these groups went out and collected data on all of these areas through observation, through study, through interviews. And they came back, and we distilled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of insights into what we thought were potentially the most consequential. So probably a couple of dozen in each of these categories. What are the unmet needs? What are the powerful emerging trends? What are the competencies and capabilities that we'll need to acquire, or that we haven't can creatively leverage? And what are the industry beliefs that deserve to be challenged? So we ended up with a long list of insights. And the next step was to say, all right, let us start to mix these insights up together. Because one of the things that had occurred to me was that when I'd studied, by this time, I had looked at probably 100 business innovators. I talked to many of these. There are people at the time like Anita Roddick at Body Shop, Michael Dell, Richard Branson. I talked to all of these people. And the question again and again had been, so where did this strategy come from? And what you found was that strategy was always kind of a happy accident. It wasn't that they sat down and said, we're going to do strategy now. But it was also clear that these people had developed some common ways of looking at the world around them. They were looking for these emerging trends that others had missed. They were alert to these unmet needs. They were thinking about how to redeploy capabilities in a new way. But it was a serendipitous process, and often what you would find that resulting opportunity was kind of a mashup of, here's a new technology that allows us to do something in a new way. Here's a need that we can put that against that technology. Here's the industry belief that we can challenge when we bring this to market. So it was clear that it wasn't a single insight that was going to drive the strategy, but it was going to be a combination of insights. So, and if you like, I can tell you more recently what's the technology we've used, because now we can all do this, online through technology and so on. And I'll give you an up-to-date example in a minute. But in any case, we started to mix these insights up and literally say, well, if I take this customer insight, this technology insight, this insight about industry dogma, what's the opportunity that lays at the intersection? And so they generated more than 2,000, I would call them maybe stratlets, like these are just little mini ideas, but 2,000 of those. And one of them is like, well, why can't you use a phone for payments? Why can't the phone send text messages as well as voice? Why can't we put a camera on it? I mean, literally 2,000 ideas like that. And I think this is the way every strategy process has to work. After being so we start out by being very divergent around insights. Let's go out and look at the world. We're not going to boil the ocean, but let's be very broad in how we think about these questions. A lot of divergence, and let's come back and say, well, what insights seem to be just have the most energy behind them, have the most portent for how we might shape our strategy. And then we did another round of divergent thinking, which says, okay, now let's look at the intersection of all these insights and imagine what new opportunities might lie there. And so you have this, again, highly divergent process where You're not diverging in terms of developing insights. Now you're diverging in terms of developing potential opportunities. And then again, we came back to a convergence stage, and we asked, all right, as you look across these 2000s, what are the powerful themes that you see here? Because often no individual idea on its own, which is, by the way, a huge mistake when companies put up idea markets and they just have like individual ideas getting voted up or down. That's, I think, the wrong way to do that. But in any case, what was clear was that there were some very powerful themes that ran across these 2,000 ideas that could form, the foundation of a strategic architecture for the company. One of those themes was that the phone was soon, or that there's a potential for the phone to become just a lifestyle device, that it wasn't a business tool sold to, business people for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. It was a consumer product that at the time, we thought about it being the next Sony Walkman. That shows you how far back that was. There was another cluster of insights around taking the phone beyond voice, and a whole set of ideas for how making it something more than just an appliance for voice calls. And then a third set of insights was really around the competitive structure of the industry and the chance if Nokia was able to develop turnkey solutions with the network equipment and with the software and with the phone and so on, and they could take that to operators, they could grow the market so fast and build capacity behind that so fast that no one else would be able to catch up, and that operators would have little incentive to work with anybody else. So that became the strategy of Nokia circa 1994. It was published in the annual report. It literally had those three legs to it around, I won't remember exactly the labels, but beyond voice, one leg, lifestyle device, another one, and integrated, infrastructure provider was a third one. And that would power those guys, that would create billions of dollars of market value and power them to become a market leader. And I think what you see in that story is both an answer to this question, well, how do you generate game-changing strategies, and also some cautionary tales about, how do you change them when they reach their sell-by date?
Yes.
And yes. So the beauty of that approach, and I think this is a huge secret in creating strategy, we ended up with a strategy that was radically aspirational and highly grounded. And often you end up with one or the other. You end up with a strategy as a flight of fancy, and some of those turn out, to be true, but it's kind of the equivalent of Elon Musk saying, let's build a Hyperloop, which may happen, by the way. But you either have this, and nobody really has a sense of how we might do that, or you end up with a strategy that's highly incremental. And this process gave us the chance to do both, because it was very clear we were starting out by saying, we have to break the model, whatever that is. We have to break the mold. We have to have a strategy that's highly differentiated, but it also is not, it has to be grounded in real observation. And so because as all of those 2,000 ideas emerged, we could go back and we could say, we believe this is an opportunity because we saw this happening in Venice Beach, or we saw this happening in the club district in Tokyo, because we talked to these technologists, and so it was all based on, I wouldn't say it was based on big data, but it was all based on observable, or if not measurable, phenomena that we looked at. The other benefit of that is when it is a highly collaborative and participative process, by the time you get to the end, and you say, okay, this is our destiny, we are going to move forward on these three vectors, you don't have to explain that to anybody. And so often what I see in the traditional strategy process, you may have some genuine learning, a small team, a group of people at the top may they may really go dig, and they may think, I'm not saying they don't, I think they can only do so much given, their limits. But whatever they come back with, then you go to the organization, and what you're presenting the organization is a summary statement. And the organization is like, well, how did you get there? And almost all of the learning that took place in that process is invisible to 99% of the people in the organization. And so you spend the next year or more trying to replay, trying to convince, trying to share what you saw that led you to that set of conclusions. And by the way, with a small group of people, often caught up in their own personal mental models, what they have to share is actually not that robust. So the advantage of doing it in this quite open way was that by the time, and everybody could see every step of this, it was visible, it was shared. So you knew exactly why you got to that particular answer. You had great confidence in that answer. And perhaps most importantly, because you created all of these kind of sub-strategies. Once you said, right, here's where we're going, and you'd extracted those themes, against each of the themes, you could start to plot the steps that would probably take to get there. You could go back to those hundreds of ideas and say, well, let's start to array these by degree of difficulty or temporal interdependence, and what should we do first and second and third and so on. So the organization launches much faster behind the new strategy and is much more committed and consistent in going after that, because everyone has had a hand in creating it. And I think so often that executives they talk about communicating strategy. That's a bullshit notion. If you're talking about communicating strategy, you're already lost, right? There's no communicating to be done when you're engaging the whole organization in a conversation about where we go next. The communication is the process. It's not something that happens after the process. So we've done this. So that's one vignette. Now, what I'll tell you happened there, which of course you would know, is all those super ambitious young people, Pekka Ala-Pietila, Sari Baldauf, I'll remember their names. They all went on to great careers. But all those enormously ambitious people who were in their early 30s that we were working with in the 1990s would go on to be extraordinarily successful and rich. And they went from being in their 30s to being in their 40s to being in their 50s, and started to believe they were invincible. And they were reading, the articles in the Financial Times that said this is the best managed tech company in the world, and you start to believe that it was your brilliance that created that strategy, not the collective brilliance of the people around you. And so, to my knowledge, Nokia never did an exercise like that again, even though at one point in around, 2004, 2005, I urged them to do so. And they ended up being caught by their own orthodoxy, which we don't have to explain. I'll talk about that if you're interested. So let me give you something we did. So what we've done since is, obviously now we can do this entire thing online. We did something, and I could send you a little case study about this if you want to read about it, but we did something a couple of years ago with Adidas in North America. So for Adidas, their single largest market is the United States, at least at the time. Maybe it's China now, but this is maybe about 4 years ago. But they had long been a kind of distant second to Nike, and were in danger of becoming third to Under Armour. And their margins were substandard. They were losing shelf space in retailers, had a fractured presence online, and were just not doing very well. So a new leader there, Mark King, who I'd known previously, asked us to come in and lead a kind of strategy hackathon. And so what we did with a couple thousand employees, essentially anybody who wanted to volunteer to be part of the process, which is most of their employees, we did exactly what we did in Nokia, but we did it all online. And we've done this in many other companies, but this is just a recent example, and one that I could talk publicly about. But for example, we put up a MOOCA online course, and we spent the first couple of online sessions helping people learn what is a business model, what is strategy, why is strategic innovation so important. And then over a period of weeks, we'd put up, we'd introduce people, we'd teach people. We teach people, how do you challenge the orthodoxies? How do you develop the habit of doing that? What are the tools? What are the intellectual disciplines you need to spot where strategies are converging and where the dead hand of tradition has impeded your ability to see with fresh eyes? And so once we did that, you learn about this as a conceptual thing, and then we'd ask people for a week or two, all right, tell us, what are the orthodoxies you think should be challenged? So like, let's see what these are and let's share them. And so this highly collaborative where everybody can see everybody else's ideas. You can follow the people who seem particularly insightful. We can cluster these things together. We can see where the overlaps are. We can do semantic analysis, and we know exactly what people are saying. Right? Why do we all believe this? This is just kind of stupid. And then we would have another couple of weeks where we ask them, okay, what do you see changing in the world around you? Right? Changing in how women think about fitness, or changing in materials technology, or changing in distribution channels. What are the trends you see gathering force around us that have the greatest potential impact or transformational power for our business? And so these are a couple of thousand people who are, they're researching this, they're online, they're having conversations, and they're putting those insights in a very kind of particular way, in a template where they can easily be shared and discussed and so on. So we did that. So by the time we're 8 weeks into this, let's say, every single employee in the company has their own personal portfolio of new insights. This is what I saw as I went through each of these questions. This is my sense of what the orthodoxies are. This is my sense of what the emerging trends are. This is my sense of what the unmet needs are. And that could be all things that came out of my own head, or it could be things that other people thought about that I kind of tagged and I adopted as my own because I thought they were really insightful. So then we spent quite a few weeks asking people, right, you have all these insights. Each of you has your personal bucket of insights. Start putting those together in a matrix and ask, what are the opportunities you see there? So I have to go back and look exactly, but I believe there were more than 10,000 ideas that got contributed. We did all the usual kind of cluster analysis and so on, and boiled that down. I think it ended up, I'll send you the case study because I may have this wrong, but I think we ended up with 9 or 16 big themes. But what was interesting was many of the things that came out would have never come out of a top-down process. So for example, a number of young employees said, what are we doing with esports? With the thousands of kids who are, playing e-games and indeed showing up in stadiums and watching this as a sport, and they're training and they're physically fit. What are we doing? Well, I can tell you the idea of esports is not going to occur to a 50-year-old marketing vice president at Adidas, right? Or probably any other company. And so again, this mobilized the company around a few very important, big new opportunities, each of which encompassed a variety of smaller ideas. And the company has, the last few years, has been firing on all cylinders and is beating all of its competitors. And I can't tell how long that lasts because no strategy is forever.